Welcome very much to this virtual evening. Welcome to have Scott Simon in Vienna again, although he can only be virtually at the place from Canada. We just found that we had him in Vienna in summer 2019. So we are looking very much forward to the next non-COVID opportunity that we are going to have in future. I think everybody knows Scott Simon. If you do not, I just read in his introduction that he first went to China in 1985. So that's ages ago. But he will talk about his many trips, studies, researches in Taiwan a little during his talk a little later, so I'm not going to talk about that here. If you are not familiar with this Scott Simon, I would propose that you go to ResearchGate or go to Google Scholar, and you are going to find pages, lists of all the articles Scott wrote. And you also have the opportunity to be familiar, get familiar with all the topics he has covered, not only in Taiwan, but also in China. I'm giving the floor to Scott as he's doing more introduction here. We are going to have a discussion after the talk, and probably Scott would very like you to open your camera during the discussion, as that way he's able to see people, like having a real true audience in a Vienna classroom. Thanks for attending and looking forward to the lecture. Scott, the floor is yours.
Dankeschön. Es ist guten Abend in Wien und in Deutschland, in Ljubljana. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ich hier sein kann, aber ich möchte so gerne echt in Wien zu sein. Es wäre so toll, echt Visit zu machen. So I'll continue in English. I just wanted to say a few words in German to thank you very much. I was invited by Professor Lipinski to give his talk today. We planned on doing it in person about Indigenous youth. And I have to admit that I was a bit of a loss about what to do with that. I've never really thought through issues of youth. But there's the question, who are the youth and who are Indigenous youth? And one of the first things that came to my mind was my father saying to me and my cousins when we were children, youth is wasted on the young. And I hope that by the end of the talk that we'll see that he was definitely wrong, and that youth is not wasted on the young, and especially in Indigenous Taiwan. So I will share my screen now so that I can show a few images as I go on. And first of all, though, I would like to do something that is very Canadian now, which is appropriate because of the Indigenous work that I do. And it, as part of our indigenization and decolonization at the university, we have gotten in the habit of beginning every public lecture with a land acknowledgement. And because I am physically right now on Algonquin territory, I will do that. I pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of the land on which I now live and work. The Algonquin territory remains unceded. I thank the traditional knowledge holders who have accompanied me on my path of knowledge. They remind me that the rivers, the veins of the earth, unite us and that we are all related. I also thank the Sedek and Durugu people who have shared their lives with me and made it possible for me to do the work that we call research in anthropology. Another thing, so today I'm do sort of a bit of a self-introduction. Then I'll introduce the field sites and the overall problematique of what we're doing. And then I'll talk about Indigenous youth in Taiwan. So this is also something that comes from our indigenization. Indigenous elders who've been helping us with our pedagogy have encouraged us to introduce ourselves when we begin to speak. It's an Algonquin way of beginning a talk, but it's a way of recognizing that what we learn is based on what we bring to the subject. It's based on the land that we've walked on, the people we are. And that's why I wanted to say I was actually not born in Canada. I was born in the United States, although my mother's family was Canadian, to a German-American family. My grandparents were insisted actually that I learn German. And so I started that in high school. I then went to Indiana University, where I had a chance to go to Hangzhou from March to July 1985, which Professor Lipinski reminds me is very, very long ago. But then I was, attached to China, but very attached to my own family's roots. And so I did a double major in East Asian studies and Germanic studies. I studied for a year in Hamburg, a year in Berlin. And actually that kind of gave me a different spin on East Asian studies, because a part of a way I began approaching China in the beginning was actually through German literature, reading books like from Hermann Hesse and Goethe, who was fascinated with chinoiserie, etc. But then I went, after I graduated and spent a year in Berlin, I took my first job in China, where I taught English at Hangzhou University and got to explore Zhejiang. I was fascinated by the mountains and the Taoist temples. I then did graduate work in anthropology. I got to do my MA research with the Taoist scholar Ken Dean. And in 1993, went to Xiangudong in Wenzhou, where I was interested to see that the temple was sponsored by leather tanners. And my professor at McGill encouraged me to go back and study the leather tanners. But by 1996, it was a bit more difficult and expensive to go to China. So I ended up in Taiwan doing the same topic. I was interested in the impact of Chinese culture on industrialization, and went to Tainan for 2 years of field work from 96 to 98. Fell in love with Taiwan, spent 5 years there the first time. And while doing postdoctoral work in Taipei with women entrepreneurs, I met Yuli Dagi, who convinced me to start studying indigenous peoples and development. And then Igong Shiba, and I'll show a photo of her, who specifically brought me to Fushicun or Busengan in later years to work with her community in Asia Cement. But in 2001, I got a job at the University of Ottawa, and that was very good for my Taiwan research, because generous funding from the Canadian government allowed me to go back continually to Taiwan until July 2020. In fact, until the pandemic struck, I was in a habit of going to Taiwan for about a 3 to 6 month visit every year, and also shorter visits. But then I was there from March to July 2020. Since I've come back, I think my big project has been finishing my book, which is called Truly Human: Indigeneity and Indigenous Resurgence on Formosa, which will be published at the end of 2022 by the University of Toronto Press. We are about to go and start really thinking about the production and the cover and so forth. So the text is done. And I will introduce that a little bit here. For the field sites where I've done work, I've started up in the north here in the Taroko National Park. Just at the foot of the park, there's a village called Busengan, which has a sub-community called Garigi or Kela. And that's where I did research. Starting in 2004, I had to do a pilot project and be invited by the community, which was very enthusiastic about the project. In 2005, I could go back for 6 months of research. And then they suggested I go down to Wanrong in the south to work in Jiagang, which I did for another 6 months in 2006. And then in 2007, I went up to Nantou, always following the paths that people recommended. I went to Goroban for another 6 months, where I had a fantastic time learning how to grow rice and living with people there. Since then, I've been a visiting scholar, going back. I went in 2012 and 13, I had another 6 months in Busengan and Buarong to work on human-bird relations funded by the Jiang Jingguo Foundation. I've had other field study trips in 2015, 17, and 19. Nungaoshan, I went out there to do some photography and work on the historical paths that the Durugu took in 2017. And the last visit was in 2020. I was supposed to spend the year from 2021 to 22 right now in Taiwan on a sabbatical leave, working on human-animal relations. But because of COVID, that came to a halt, and instead I've been at home working on my book. So those are my field sites. Igong Shiban really has been very important in bringing me to the community. And so here she is at a demonstration in front of the Taroko National Park against Asia Cement. And they've been successful in some of their legal claims against the company. But basically, the book that I'm working on now, it takes a different spin. My first book was from the year 2012. I wrote a book in French called Sejek Balai, L'Autochthonie Formosant dans tous ses états. That means, Sejek Balai means real people. Some of you have probably seen the film, Warriors of the Rainbow, Sedek Balai, which is a similar name. And that's because the people call themselves, or they call other people whom they admire, Sedek Balai. So real people. It's the courageous people who protect their territory and their sovereignty and uphold Gaia, which is the law of the Durugu and Sedek peoples. In the Tayal, it's called Gaga. So basically, as I've been thinking about indigeneity and doing all of this research and giving talks and presentations like the one today and gone to conferences, I find there's sometimes resistance just to even talk about indigenous people in Taiwan. When I was in the PRC, for example, I gave a talk at a lecture at a conference sponsored by the Canadian Embassy, and one of the Chinese scholars at the end told me there are no indigenous people in Taiwan, so you have some mistaken assumptions here. I have also talked to people who are interested in indigenous solidarity, including at the United Nations, and there seems to be support of indigenous Taiwanese groups, less so for the Taiwanese government trying to show up in the clothing of indigenous people. In terms of sociology and anthropology, there's also been discussion about what does indigeneity mean. One example is the German scholar Michael Rudolph, who did very careful ethnography in the same communities, and borrowed the idea from political scientist Paul Brass, the idea that ethnic self-consciousness, ethnically based demands, and ethnic conflict can occur only if there is some conflict between indigenous and external elites and authorities, or between indigenous elites. And I've thought through that, for most of my career. And I think that the place where I disagree is only on the word only. And so we'll get into that today as well, as I think about indigenous social movements and young people. I think it's important to remember that there's a very long history. A quote here from Canadian missionary George Leslie Mackay from 1895, who wrote, "These Aboriginal inhabitants held the island to be theirs by the right of centuries of possession, and when the Chinese came, they were regarded as intruders who would not respect native rights." So there's a very long history of these peoples having a very clear idea of their political sovereignty and a very different identity. And there are real concerns, such as those of hunters, and many hunting practices are still illegal. And so in my book, I wrote, every time a Sejek man traps a boar or shoots a squirrel in the forest, he affirms sovereignty over his territory. So in the new book that I'm writing, I took a different approach to writing. And what I did basically was I wanted to explore Gaia, which again is the Sedek and Durugu, they use the same word for the sacred or ancestral law. It's their political ontology, their way of being. And so in the book, I looked through 5 different concepts from the Durugu language among the Sedek peoples. And I'm not going to go into any of this really in depth right now, but the first is Saman, so the forest animals. And that was what I talked about in Vienna some years ago. Magaya, which literally means implementation of the law, is the Durugu word for the practices of headhunting that went on. Uduk are the spirits, I have some good stories to tell about relationships with spirits. Lungangan is something that I think this is what Mikhail Rudolph and I both came across, is that when people were using their heart, lulungan, to reflect upon the ethics of how they and people around them were engaging with Taiwan's political system. And so we can't expect a definitive answer. Diminun is weaving. So I talked there about how social memory is expressed through such things as monuments and also in creating new identities. But today we're going to talk about youth, and I think that's something that goes through all of this, because for example, we've got older men who take younger men to go hunting with them in the forest. Nagaya was the ritual by which young men became adult men in the past. So it's always there. Youth is always there through all of this. But I'm going to reflect on that a little bit more explicitly. And actually, for the first time in a long time, I'm going to draw back on my sociological training as I take a look at that. So I think that talking about the youth gives us an opportunity to reflect upon where youth fit into Gaia, where the social movements belong. So really, in a way, this is about the future of Gaia. So with that introduction, I will go into the talk with some photos here. I'll start with that. And I think that these are some of the ways that we often imagine Indigenous youth. We imagine them as being political activists. So the one on the left, we see here a photo from December 2014 at the front of the Taroko National Park. It was a protest against the Asia cement mine on Turku territory. If you look on the bottom left there, we see a young woman with a sign saying that she is from the Taiwan Indigenous Turku Student and Youth Club. And then on the right-hand side, we see a photo, which I think people will recognize as one of the LGBT rallies in Taiwan that led to marriage equality. And that was from a rally for marriage equality in Taipei in 2016. And there were Indigenous LGBT supporters showing up in full regalia there, and we see the Sedek and the Amis clothing here. I do recognize that these are probably university students. Looking at youth has been a bit of a challenge, I think, for the anthropologists. That's kind of why I wanted to dive into a little bit in sociology. But anthropology has a long history of studying childhood and youth as ages of human development or stages of human development that culminate in adulthood. For decades, anthropologists looking at youth looked at topics like initiation ceremonies, sexual practices, courtship and marital customs, rituals to adulthood. But it was always assumed, or mostly, that youth was a preparation for adulthood. And one of the arguments that went around, I'm thinking about people like Margaret Mead, was that only Western societies with our universities and modern labor markets had a large population of youth at ages between puberty and then marriage and reproduction. So this long period of time without reproduction. And the idea was that non-Western societies did that differently. Those ideas have kind of changed in the field of anthropology, but also in global societies. And so nowadays, the definition of youth in anthropology has enlarged, and it's included topics such as political engagement, economic and educational opportunities, gender and sexuality, culture change, consumption patterns, and so much more. So the role of LGBT Indigenous youth would be a perfect topic for anthropology today. Mary Buchholz in 2002 said in Annual Review of Anthropology that anthropologists, quote, are particularly well situated to offer an account of how young people around the world produce and negotiate cultural forms. And I think that's precisely what's happening now as Indigenous youth in Taiwan are negotiating and thinking through their place in society. So we're not talking about like an anthropologist might have done 100 years ago about rituals that give them the right to get a tattoo. We're talking about young people looking for a place in contemporary Taiwan, using the internet, social media, doing all kinds of things, often in English as well as Chinese, and learning their own indigenous language, sometimes as a second language rather than a first one. And so we can kind of think about, what are the priorities of indigenous youth? Where do they fit into social movements? What can they tell us about the topics that I'm interested in my book, indigeneity and indigenous resurgence? They're really branched into the internet. They've been doing things as well. Like last year, there was a rally for Black Lives Matter in Taipei. Now, that being said, it's kind of a challenge for me to write about them based on my field notes and interviews alone. I didn't really necessarily write about them as being youth. I thought of them, for example, as being workers or as being durugu or sedek. Also, the people who are young today are the people who are growing up from 2001 until 2020 when I was doing my research. And so they're often very small children. And I was never allowed to do research or do interviews with anyone under the age of 18. So anyway, I think that I did end up spending a lot of time with young people in their 20s, and these are mostly day laborers. And so that's what these next pictures are for, just to show some pictures of daily life with ordinary people. And one thing is, in the summer, after they've worked in the rice paddies or construction sites, that they'll go and enjoy the river, and on the weekends too, and go fishing or have barbecues. And they really use their traditional territory and claim the right to do that. It's a real claim of sovereignty as well. It's something that I've learned to look at rather nostalgically, because in Canada, Indigenous peoples are often unable to access their rivers and traditional territories because there's so much private property. But in Taiwan, so much of the place is available. So I think that there are many ways of looking at this, but I think that a long time ago, not just a few decades ago, when I started doing my research there, people thought about Indigenous people as being in distant, rather inaccessible parts of the island. Sometimes even in Taipei, people give me the impression they still think that way. It was part of the way of thinking about indigeneity, because for a long time, they were called Shanti Tongbao, mountain compatriots. For a long time as well, even people from different indigenous groups had to get a rusanzhen, a mountain permit, to go into an area. And then the indigenous movement made demands for zhengming, 土地自治, name rectification, land, and autonomy. And they had their first successes about the time that I went to Taiwan, because in 1994, the name in the constitutional revisions of the additional articles of the Constitution was no longer Shanti Tongbao, they made it Yuanzumi. And then in 1997, when I was already in Taiwan, they changed it to Yuanzu Minzu, indigenous peoples. That has important implications in law. But I'm not sure that really the lawmakers in Taiwan really grasped that, because Article 10 ends mysteriously with the same protection and assistance shall be given to the people of the Penghu, Jinmen, and Matsu areas. Now, indigenous activists, though, on Formosa, the main island there, have been really trying to get back the traditional territory that was nationalized by Japan and was kept under state rule by the Republic of China. And there's been, the issue that, people in the village are not necessarily interested in those particular demands. I think name rectification has been one thing that has really confused people. They're not, Mikhail Rudolph was talking about how they didn't necessarily like the new title of Yuanzumin. When I was there, they were questioning Durugu and Sedek as Saidekudzu and Tailukudzu, which they've also now gotten used to. But they have their own lives, the majority. And here's some pictures of other perfectly ordinary indigenous youth. Something that's very important to them is the church. And so youth choirs are big, and often they're there with their drums and they're dancing and have a very different approach to Christianity than their elders. And the one on the right is a group, intergenerational, where they go back. These were people who went from Jiagang up to rather high in the mountains of the Taroko National Park to Losao, where they used to live before the Japanese made the move down to the plains. And so that kind of creates a Durugu identity for everybody there, no matter what they end up doing with their lives later on, going to university or being construction workers, and no matter what their political views are. And another photo here are just showing some of the perfectly mundane things that people are really into, like, you know, winning a softball match, and which is what these women are celebrating. And so, you know, the lives of Indigenous youth are very varied, and that's what I want to talk about for the next few minutes of my talk. One thing I did was I started looking at demographics, and this is, you know, the population pyramid that we call of the Indigenous people in Taiwan. And we can see there's a big bulge right down there about the 15 to 20 years old. And so this is from 2017. So now they're a little bit higher up there, but the youth are really important in Taiwanese Indigenous society. It's a very young population. We can contrast that with Taiwan, which, that's Austria. There we go, Taiwan, where you can see a bit older in their late 30s, early 40s. And it's just for fun, I compared it to Austria because we can see this, kind of see where, and Austria has an older population as well. So where are the people, the Indigenous youth of Taiwan? And, you know, sometimes I give talks and people remind me that half of them live in urban areas. And I think it's important to kind of think through that carefully, because Indigenous people are not all the same. And one of the big distinctions is the legal distinction between mountain Indigenous people and plains Indigenous people. That's an important distinction in law, because one thing is that they vote on two different electoral rolls in the elections for the legislators, for the legislative unit. But they also, the mountain groups have access to reserve land, whereas other groups, the plains people, don't. And so the mountain group have a guaranteed land base, and that kind of keeps people in their communities, I think. And so I found that 70% of the Durugu still keep their household in Hualien. There are about 17% of the Durugu are in that area from Taipei to Taoyuan, and 13% are everywhere, including Jinmen and Mazu actually have a few Durugu people, which was a bit surprising to me. And I made a list here of where they are, and kind of see that Hualien is the #1 place for Indigenous youth to be, followed by Taoyuan, which is no surprise because that's where manufacturing is quite located. Nantou, the other place where I did research, is 8. And even if I look at lower level statistics like Sholing and Wanrong and Renai, you know, Sholing has 2,739 Indigenous youth. And so I think we can see that. Now, some people might say that the household registration doesn't mean that they're actually in those communities. But when I am in those communities, I see a lot of young people who are able to commute every day to go to work in Taichung or urban Hualien and so forth. And so, and they tell me as well, I've had young people tell me that they tried living in Taipei and they encountered discrimination when they were looking for jobs or apartments. And when they did get a job, the pay wasn't high enough for them to have the lifestyle they wanted to have, because it was so expensive just to have an apartment in Taipei. And so people have told me that it's the combination of discrimination and high living costs that brings them from Taipei back to the villages. And so I think that there really is, and probably especially as they're founding families and like to have grandparents around, that there really is a return to the villages that's going on right now. So then I took a look at what Indigenous people are doing, and in particular, the young one. I wanted to see if there's some change going on. I didn't find too much of a change, as we'll see here. But the labor force participation is quite high, 62.2% for Indigenous people in Taiwan as a whole. Unemployment of only 3.98%. The main Sectors for Indigenous people as a whole are manufacturing, construction, accommodations, and catering. So working in restaurants or hotels and so whatnot for the tourism. But 46% are involved in some kind of manual labor, which we see as categories called craft-related workers, machinery and equipment operators and assemblers, or low-skilled and manual workers. And then the wages are quite low. The average is around 30,000 NT dollars. For Taiwan as a whole, it's around 40,000. So they earn about 75% of the general population. Nearly half earn less than NT $30,000 a month. In my book that I'm publishing with Toronto, I compare this to Canada, and it's rather shocking to see that Canada has a much lower labor force participation rate, a very high unemployment rate, and again, poverty and much lower wages than the general population. But we take a look here at the youth here, and I found, not surprisingly, that there's a gap between the 20 years to 24 years and the 25 to 29-year-olds. Labor force participation is 61.91%. And I think that's because there are people who are not in the labor market because they are in school. Once they graduate, that goes up. And this is a really dynamic group with labor force participation of 86.95%. Unemployment is a bit higher. That's because unemployment is measured by the number of people who are actively looking for jobs. So younger people are more likely to be looking for jobs or looking to change jobs than older people who are not in the labor force. The top sectors are a little bit different: manufacturing, accommodations and catering, wholesale and retail sales. So they're getting into the services. I think the tourism market has been very attractive to many young people, but also these can be temporary jobs as they're going to school, for example. And I noticed that when we get past 25, there are more of them going into construction. But still, about a third of them are in manual labor. Irregular work is very important. The main ones are in agriculture, forestry, fishing, and pasturing, which is something that I saw as well, where a lot of young people go and work as day laborers on farms. In fact, for the 6 months in Garuban, that's what I did. I worked as a day laborer on rice paddies. And again, they earn less than $30,000 a month quite often. So that's kind of sets up the sociological background for what we're going to see. And we should really keep this in mind, that when we're talking about the youth, only about 1 out of 5 Indigenous youth goes to university. And so those first photos that I showed of the social movements are attractive to university students, but then there's that other 80% of people who are living their lives in a very different way. Military service is, of course, very important for young Indigenous men, and quite often they're proud of their military service for the rest of their life, and they show photos of it and talk about it after they come back. So what I wanted to do with the time that's left here, because the time is going rather quickly, is take a look at some of the youth that have become prominent in their own ways in the public sphere and in our days of the internet. So I'm going to try to show a few clips and some photos from the internet as well in this second half of my talk. I think that since I began doing research in Indigenous communities 20 years ago, the opportunities for Indigenous youth really to have this public persona on the internet, on social media, in traditional media as well, has really multiplied exponentially. When I started my research, and this is about 2004, so really in the early 2000s, there were clubs at universities. They tended to have their activities in person, of course, on campus, which they still do because Taiwan's not as COVID prone as the rest of us. But they used something called BBS, or these internet bulletin boards, to communicate with one another and then organize things and then do things in person, but very few people other than that immediate circle was into that. Nowadays, everyone has a smartphone. It's incredible to see that now even elderly people are getting cell phones because their children buy them for them. And I see parents buying iPads for their grade school children. And so there's a lot of activity on social media. Taiwan, which has a population of 24 million, has over 19 million Facebook accounts. So about 80%. That's one of the highest Facebook penetration rates in the world. And in fact, every day I'm using Facebook and Line to be in contact with my Indigenous friends who I've known for a long time. There's also Taiwan Indigenous TV, and it broadcasts Indigenous content, often in Indigenous languages, 24 hours a day. And so these are all platforms that Indigenous youth are using in very creative ways, including youth groups that are part of the Indigenous social movement. The Indigenous Youth Front is the most visible. It's one that I've had a bit more contact with. They have every year on February 28th, they have what they call smoke signals, or langyan is what they call it in Chinese, the wolf smoke. And so it's a way of demonstrating Indigenous sovereignty. And they choose that date very appropriately because they're looking for some kind of solidarity with Taiwanese people. There's also the Lima, Taiwan Indigenous Youth Working Group. The word Lima comes from the word for 5 in most of the Austronesian languages in Taiwan and outside of Taiwan. And it also means hand in many languages, although not Turugu. And the word hand is a way of really reaching across and seeking solidarity between groups. And Lima has been one of the groups, among many groups, that actually visit the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. These young groups reach out to other progressive social movements. In the early days, like in the year 2000, on May 1st, I was there for an Indigenous labor march in Taipei. So in the earlier years, there were these big connections with the labor movement and the environmental movement, such as on Orchid Island's nuclear waste and the Asia cement issue. That's still there. But there's also now much more cooperation with the LGBT movement, for example. There was just this month on Indigenous TV, there was an interesting talk show in which a group of young LGBT Indigenous people, youth people, young students, they're students in their early 20s, told about their experience of coming out in their villages and debated about whether it's harder for Indigenous people to come out or not. And so there are all kinds of interesting things going on. But they're not always explicitly political. I think this photo here of Lobing Mio, he's 19 years old. I don't think that he's explicitly too political, but we'll take a look at that. But by affirming their identity as strongly and as publicly as they do, it is still proving, I think, the axiom that the personal is the political. And so one doesn't necessarily have to march on the street with a sign to be political. One can offer some wine to the spirits and also be political. So I want to take a look at these, and I'm hoping that the sharing screen works well on this. So I will go to, and the first one is the Facebook. So I think that's pretty obvious here. I found this one to be very interesting. An Indigenous friend sent this to me. He was kind of concerned about this, actually. And this is a photo of a young Sedek woman from Guruban. Her name is Wenmeng Shen, and she's apparently the first Sedek woman to have a tattoo done. And so we see her here. She consulted the elders in Nantou on how to do this, and they did it in the traditional fashion. She's not the first person that I've run into with a facial tattoo. Actually, Mikael Rudolph wrote in his book about Pitaro, a Durugu musician who had a facial tattoo, and he talked about how that's part of his persona as an entertainer. And Wen Mengxuan is herself also a performer, and so she's involved in dance. And so this is one way also of affirming Sedic tradition. And so we don't know what's going to happen next. Another example I'll give is to freedom here. And I will show this. It was part of the MOFA's public relations campaign on September 8th, 2021. It was part of their attempt to gain international support for Taiwan having access to the United Nations General Assembly. And so they had this video called To Freedom with a 17-second segment labeled Equal Rights for Ethnic Minorities. We have this dramatic image already here of the Pacific Ocean. We will see a young man in red and white woven clothing. This is very traditional Sedic clothing. And he sits alone at a table, which I don't think that the shamans would have done traditionally. And he pours rice wine into glass cups, and then he puts a daran, the divinatory bamboo stick, in his hand. And then we see a hawk flying over, as if that's the bird representing the ancestors giving their approval. And so as he does that, he says, as a 10th generation shaman in my community, I feel the spirit of my ancestors gave me my vocation. I will continue to study to continue this culture of rights. Mofa's Facebook explains that he is 19-year-old Lobing Mio from the Sedic Toda indigenous community in Hualien's Tagarong village. He claims an identity as a Masabuch, so the shaman. And he's the second young male shaman I know in Hualien. His claim to this is not entirely without controversy in his own community. And then Mofa says on the Facebook page about him, quote, if the UN states parts of its mission as encouraging countries around the world to respect the rights of their people, Taiwan's vision of global partnership can serve as a valuable reference, unquote. And actually, I've been in communication with him, and I have agreed to help him with his research project. And quite interestingly, I actually knew his grandmother since the beginning of my research, and she is the shaman who gave me my Durugu name of Wadan Wadis, of Wadis Wadin. And so I'm called Wadis because of his grandmother. So I'll go ahead and show this 17-second clip here.
Yakuka smapo, misabo kni, ka utulutam pikun nako, ikada kadadu snohai smapo, mohwai namupaday.
So time is going quickly, but I think we can take a short look at the beginning of a very touching speech which a Punon woman, Samgaz Valentina, gave on behalf of the Indigenous Youth Front at a rally for Black Lives Matter on June 13th, 2020. And I think this is really exciting. I've actually written a bit about this one because I think that this act of solidarity and friendship across borders with Black Lives Matter is really something that's very different that young people are coming up with. I think that previous generations have reached out to other indigenous communities. For example, I know people who go to the Philippines regularly to go to the Cordillera. I've been involved because I've been invited to go along sometimes as interpreter when they visit Canadian First Nations communities. But here's one where we have Indigenous youth thinking about their situation as students, as urban people, and having facing discrimination and racism and really seeing something they have in common with Black people in North America. And so I'll just show, it's a 9-minute clip, which is too much to show here, but I'll just show the first few minutes of this so you can get an idea of that. And anybody who wishes to watch the whole thing can take note of how to find it on YouTube.
And so Jaden will do the translation for me. Okay. 公藏的包括小红案，把您进来的。大家好，我是小红安，然后我的妈妈是来自卓社群的布农族法林吉兰家族。我刚刚用布农族语跟各位自我介绍，这个是我唯一会说的布农族语。Hello everyone, I'm Sabungat. My mother comes from the Takituru community, from the Bunong people, and from the Valentina family. I just introduced to you myself to you in Bunong language, but that was the only Bunong language I can speak. 因为在台湾过去的威权时期，政府禁止我们说任何的在地语言，所以我们这一代所有在台上的原住民青年都是失语的一代。And that was because back in an authoritarian era of Taiwan, our government banned us from speaking our native languages. That is why all the indigenous youth you see right now on the stage, we are from a generation that have lost our mother tongue. 我们是原住民族青年阵线，今天我们站出来支持这个行动，不只是为了在美国黑人受到长期的社会歧视和不当待遇发声，更是要呼吁台湾社会乃至全世界看见更多遭受不平等对待的族群，不论是原住民、LGBT、移工或是新住民。We are from a group called Indigenous Youth Front. Today, we are coming out to support Black Lives Matter, not just because we want to speak up against the long-term social discrimination and mistreatment of Black people in America. Moreover, we would like to call on the Taiwanese society or even the world to see the many more groups that are going through discrimination and unfair treatment, be it indigenous groups, the LGBTQ community, migrant workers, or the immigrants. 在台湾，原住民族遭受从过去400年开始遭受不同的新的政权在这个土地上殖民我们。For the past 400 years, the indigenous folks have been going through colonization and mistreatment from different regimes at different time in history. 日本人来的时候，要我们取日本名字，学日语。When the Japanese people came, they wanted us to have Japanese names and to learn how to speak Japanese. 中国人来的时候，要我们取汉人的名字，要我们学中文。When the Chinese people came, they wanted us to have Han names and they wanted us to learn Mandarin. 我们在外来者的殖民下，被迫不能成为自己的样子，要符合殖民者的想象，许多的文化记忆都被迫流失，传统组织和规范也式微了。Under the colonization of the intruders, we are forced to be unable to become who we really were originally. We have to fit the imagination of the colonizers.
So I think that because of time, we can't show the whole thing, but that gives us just the first 3 minutes there, a really good image of what's happening there. That we have a generation now of urban indigenous youth who did not grow up speaking their language, but who really affirm this identity and are thinking through indigeneity from very much of the perspective of being colonized. They really struggle, I think, with the issue that they don't speak the language. One young scholar from the Turku area, she says that these young people, when they go back to their village, they often feel alienated. Sometimes they're not accepted by their kinspeople in the villages. And so young people are going through some really interesting things with thinking about what it means to be indigenous, or for some of them, they've got one indigenous and one non-indigenous parent. And so really thinking about what all of this means. And then a final thing from the internet is New Bloom. It's an online magazine that shows radical perspectives here on Taiwan and the Asia Pacific. And here they did an interview with them in New York at the Permanent Forum. And I think that they brought up a concept here, which I've heard many times in Taiwan as well. And that's the question of indigenous independence. So between independence and unification, they're thinking, let's let those Han people decide those things for themselves. But for us, we want indigenous independence, or yuandu. An example of that, which I had the honor of actually translating a talk in Toronto by Namok Nofu Pasida, who talks about how indigenous people have their own ideas of sovereignty. And in this particular article, Valagas Gajiljaman or Gasi says about sovereignty, she's regarding this topic, it's very much like in our culture when we discuss the concept of a center and the periphery of a circle. The place of Taiwanese indigenous people in Taiwanese history as an ethnic group, the special characteristic is that indigenous independence is like the center of a circle. After all, in this country, in this island, we were the first people. In the process of history, Taiwan has had many immigrants, which has enriched Taiwan's history, like adding layers to this circle. And goes on saying that indigenous independence is not about drawing up divisive boundaries, but it's about how in this country, indigenous peoples want to have their own land, their own knowledge and education systems to preserve indigenous culture. And so I think that's what indigenous resurgence is all about. And we're running out of time. I want to get back to my PowerPoint here. And just some conclusions here that Taiwan's indigenous population is young and dynamic. Sociologically, they are part of an ethnic group that is oppressed, marginalized. A sociological approach, which I do to a certain extent, although it's necessary to understand the context and to understand where these people fit in, like to know that the university students are 20% of the, I can easily overlook the historical weight of colonialism and the fact that indigenous peoples are nations that have never ceded their sovereignty to any external state. In the Japanese and early Republic of China eras, the state created the institutions of indigeneity with the goal of assimilating indigenous peoples. This created a dependent indigenous elite as mediators between state and community. But the people never forgot their original sovereignty and colonial situation. Those elderly trappers remind me of that. Those ordinary people that took me fishing and swimming in the stream told me that. It's not just a claim being made by students in Taipei. Democratization and industrialization led to the formation of an indigenous social movement that contested these institutions of indigeneity and brought about political change in these institutions. But indigeneity, we're talking about the Council of Indigenous Peoples, the 6 members of the legislature, et cetera, is still a state project. All of that, which is very public, creates the illusion of elite competition. But that's not all that's going on. I would say that within the affordances of indigeneity, so the state creates these structures and doesn't expect these new things to go on. So within the affordances of indigeneity, indigenous resurgence is taking root. This resurgence, all kinds of projects like indigenous movements, but people writing fiction, people making films, etc., depends on the dynamism of indigenous youth. And in particular, an educated youth with communication skills, as we saw in those 4 examples from the internet. Indigenous youth are rooted in their communities still. They visit them even if they live in Taipei. They are doing their very best to keep Gaia or other similar laws in other groups alive. And they're connecting this moral guideposts of Gaia to other national and other even global political projects. They have valuable ideas for the future of Taiwan in the world and even for global society as we deal with such issues as racism and climate change. I think that we can all learn from them. So I want to thank all of the funders that I've had for the years to spend so much time in Indigenous Taiwan. One of these actually permitted me to go to Heidelberg and work on animism and human-animal relations in the changing Austronesian world with Guido Sprenger there. And that became the base, the theoretical base, actually reading a lot of things in German for my next project called Austronesian Worlds, Human-Animal Entanglements in the Pacific Anthropocene. Hopefully that will restart again in July of next year, but we'll just have to see what happens to COVID. And Mahuai Namo Barai, I would like to thank everybody for your attention today and thank everybody by some nice images here that will go into my new book next year. So thank you, everybody. Vielen Dank.
Okay. Okay, now I can talk and everybody can talk. And Zhong Lao Shi also has a picture that's so very nice of you, but I would ask everybody else to activate their cameras to give us sort of talking to people. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Kuhlmann is also available and he was the first to register for this lecture. So that is the St. Augustine contact. Scott, have you ever been to St. Augustine?
No.
No? You can open your microphone, Dirk.
Yeah, in this case, welcome and to St. Augustine. We are a research institute supported by the Steiler Missionare, and we do research on and publish on Chinese culture and history and religion. We have a journal, Monumenta Serica, and 2 monograph series. And I'm very happy for the opportunity to have listen to your talk today, because I started to do research in Taiwanese indigenous literature some 2 years ago. And I was very much reminded from what you told about youth and indigenous youth from literary competitions in Taiwan on indigenous literature, Sinophone literature. And they do have a section on young writers, which are very interesting contributions and very outspoken on reflecting topics of being indigenous in Taiwanese society through literature. So I got this impression of a very dynamic and vivid group there. So thank you very much.
Good, thank you. It's nice to meet you. Well,
yeah,
we can be in touch about that by email.
would be happy to do that.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Of course. A Taiwanese in Vienna told me that actually the Tainan Museum of Literature is planning to translate more Taiwanese, might be more indigenous literature, even do German language translations. Yeah. So of course, we as Germans, we are very much looking forward to the German part, as Scott is.
Yes.
Improve your German all times.
Yeah. And I actually had the pleasure of doing a translation myself this in the past few months. I was invited to translate a children's picture book about the Taiwan and their stories of sun eggs and snakes and pottery into English. And so I enjoyed that very much, and I let them know that I did. So I might actually be part of that translation work.
That is probably also another thing that we are going to do in Vienna in future, is to look at children's books. Because actually, if we do have Taiwanese children's books and the university is starting to acquire a few, that makes it easier for students, I believe.
Mhm.
May I ask the first question, Scott?
Yes.
I do have a question on the military service you mentioned. You told us that indigenous youth actually enjoy their military service, or would remember the service at all times. Somehow this reminds me of the Japanese colonial period. The Japanese recruited indigenous to become soldiers in their army. So you do have indigenous names, souls, at the Yasukuni shrine in Japan. So what about this legacy? And what about today?
No, I think you're right that this is something that's continued. And actually, when I was in the villages, spending time with these young people who had just finished their military service, and they were very proud of what they had done, and shared stories. And so one of them, for example, he was actually the one that was diving off of the rock in that picture there. He liked to tell stories about when he was a frogman and the distances that he would swim. And he was very proud to talk about that. I mean, these are mountain people. They're not the swimmers, but he did that. And he said that the people from Lanyu were incredible because they could, swim in the ocean for 5 or 6 hours. And but he told me all kinds of stories about that. And I see a continuity as well, because I did formal interviews with some of the older people and noted that the ones who had served in the Japanese army are still around, or they were still around, 15 years ago. And, and they were very proud of what they had done. And people in the village were proud of them as well, and would praise them, say that they have a Japanese spirit. And that Japanese spirit that they have was that they're honest and they're hardworking. And so I think that this is really the Sejek Balai is being expressed through this, even until today, with young people, being the frogmen in the ROC army. And maybe it has to do with the old warrior traditions. They said that they were really happy to go to war for Japan because it gave them a chance to kind of resurrect some of their warrior traditions. And I think
that's the ROC military.
The Japanese. So they were.
And nowadays, the military of nowadays, they have a special indigenous part?
No.
Command?
No, they're with everybody else. And I think that they still get something out of it. They're not going to war like they did for the Japanese. I think back then that was the attraction of it. In fact, amazingly, for anybody who's seen the film Sedek Belai, they were just massacred in 1930. But that community of Galuban, when the Japanese went looking for volunteers, all of the young men wanted to go. And they actually had to have a lottery system because they couldn't take so many people. And so I think that back then it was really wanting to be warriors. But I think now it's more of enjoying, the physical stamina of the training and the swimming and the running and so forth. And they enjoy that.
That would be interesting for military strategy, specifically the frogman you mentioned. There is this water technique that is now very much promoted, as far as I know, in Taiwan by the military. So probably we could argue for an indigenous command.
Yeah.
Is that possible with all the different tribes sort of working together?
Yeah. Well, this is kind of off the topic here, but I remember visiting Switzerland and being very impressed that everybody is on reserve and actually has some equipment in their homes.
Mhm.
And I always thought that that would be a good model for Taiwan, and maybe a good reason to legalize using modern hunting rifles, because then you could have all of those indigenous men who know how to use a rifle and would be prepared and armed in the case of an invasion. But you know, that's just an idea that I've had.
Yes, but did you mention the idea in Taiwan?
Yes, I've mentioned it to people, and generally indigenous people that I've mentioned it to say that would be an excellent idea. We really should legalize hunting and have good rifles. And then the non-indigenous people that I've spoken to, including some people in the government, have said, well, that would be too dangerous to have armed civilians.
Mhm.
So I think there's a real concern about what that would lead to if civilians were armed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's look for the chat. Do I have to do that?
Yeah. Well, I see a question.
Yeah, we can open it.
Okay,
Okay,
she
that
says,
is Rafael. Thank you very much. Do you have the third question? I've seen some indigenous wearing indigenous clothing. How common is that among indigenous youth? And do they gain interest in traditional wearing techniques?
Mhm.
Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll just answer that rather quickly. But it's very uncommon to see indigenous youth wearing indigenous clothing. The Amis have their harvest festival in which all the young people go back to the village, and no matter where they live in Taiwan, they're expected to do that, and they wear their indigenous clothing. But it's mostly something that would be for very formal ceremonial occasions of some type. These clothing weddings, they do weddings in the South. So it would be for very special occasions. And I think that by wearing that to that LGBT rally, they are saying that this is a very solemn and serious occasion. And so, you know, basically for anybody young or not so young, it's very unusual to wear the regalia. It really is important for ceremonial purposes, but they wear the blue jeans and t-shirts that everybody else wears. There are people who are interested in traditional weaving. And of course, every group is different. The Sedek and the Durugu have the weaving and the Atayal as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an interest among some women, and even some men are taking an interest in that now, which is just something new. But yeah, there are weaving workshops across the island. I think it's a minority, but it is a minority doing something that's very important. And also some artists who are bringing weaving into their art. And so there was one actually at the Ottawa Art Gallery some years ago.
Yeah, and probably it's also promoted for tourism.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be true? Like in tourist shops, you would have, yeah.
Yeah, it's promoted. You can buy these things. You can buy weavings at the airports in Taiwan and so forth, but they're very expensive. Just because labor costs are high in Taiwan, and often what happens is that there are companies that will take the Taiwanese weaving patterns and then go to China to have them made there so they can sell them at affordable prices. So actually what you see being sold in Taiwan's tourist areas, if it's not too expensive, it's probably from China.
Yeah, we have to look in the back and see if there is a Thai sign.
Yeah.
But for the indigenous, is that okay if their own clothes are sort of meant for tourism or bought by tourists?
Well, I think that the comments that I've heard, they're a little bit, I think that for the example, the Dao are a bit uncomfortable about tourists buying their clothing, the loincloth. They don't like that. I think that the Paiwan and the Lukai also have some strong opinions about that. I think that the Durugu and Sejek are a little bit different because they make cloth. And so the cloth can be made into things like bags or cell phone bags or eyeglass carriers. And I think that they like the idea of having their art craft going out into the world in a way. There's a whole law about this intellectual property rights and how to do that. And so I think that, you know, that's something that's acceptable. The criticisms I've heard have been of actually Turuku people themselves who will take the weaving patterns and then go to China and have things made and then sell them. So I think they see that as a moral issue.
But that would be a general topic in Taiwan, I think.
Yeah.
Taking patterns. I know that from female designing ladies who had the same experience. They designed a pattern and then or somebody else took it to China, and it became very common and very cheap, rather cheap comparatively. Yeah.
So I see 3 hands.
Yes, please. Mr. Jung, you could open your microphone and talk to us.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you for Professor, your presentation, which is very inspiring. Even I'm Taiwanese, I have very, very little knowledge about indigenous people in Taiwan because I am Minnan and Hakka tribes. I have 2 questions I want to raise, although maybe it will be a bit in depth. Is that about religion? As we say, Kuomintang, KMT era have influence on those indigenous people that have some Christianity or Catholic belief. I want to know if can share your research, is that the youth people, do they also have some influence from Christianity, and do they have, dual belief in religions? For example, they believe the ancient spirits and believe in God at the same time. I don't know. You are the expert. And the second question is, I really appreciate that you mentioned that the youth use quite a lot of multimedia. For example, the smartphone, Facebook, even show us some page from the Aboriginal girl. I think that is a very political thing. Just want to understand Aboriginal youth. Do they support what kind of ideology they have? China sometimes using those kind of Aboriginal codes says that, Aboriginal people is belonging to us, Gaoshan-Zhu, Ame-Zhu, because they are using these codes in some kind of the program in China. And by this way, this approach to convincing people that Taiwanese Aboriginal people supporting united to system together, or one country to system, whatever. So I just want to know those kind of media, what kind of influences in a political approach aspect. Thank you.
Okay, I will turn around here and kind of give a pitch for this book here.
Do advertise. We do have the book, of course. It's online in our catalog.
Good. It's called Taiwan's Contemporary Indigenous Peoples, and I have the chapter in here on religion. So your first question, the long answer is in the book, but I'll give you the short answer right now. And the short answer is that, 590,000 indigenous people in Taiwan, the vast majority of them are Christian of some kind. And there are of course differences in different communities. The communities tended to convert together as a group. But the 3 main denominations are the Roman Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, and the True Church of Jesus Christ, 真耶稣教会, which was founded in China. All of these churches tend to have their way of engaging with politics. And so the Presbyterian Church is the one that has been really the incubator of the social movement. And so many of the ideas, including using the name 原住民 or 原住民族, that was introduced through activities of the Presbyterian Church, which helped found the first indigenous rights movement in Taipei. And so the church is fundamental in the churches. All three of them are really fundamental in how indigenous people relate to society. But you also ask the question, how do they relate to their old religion? And again, this is very different whether you're with the Paiwan and the Lukai in the south, or with the Tayal and Sedek and Dugo. That's the word that I know. And actually, I showed the image of that young shaman by the ocean. His grandmother, a shaman, the one who called me Wadis, she explained that there are two ways in which indigenous people look at the existence of the old spirits and the God and Jesus and everything that came with the church, right? One of them is to see it as a parallel world. And so when they're in the village, they are Christian, they go into the mountain, it exists alongside them. And they become traditionalists when they go in the mountains. And I have encountered a few people who are traditionalists and want nothing to know about church. Many people have different ideas. She said another way is horizontal. So they imagine that there's God above, and then below are the uduch, the traditional spirits, the ancestral spirits in the people. And some of the churches are very fundamentalist though. And so, especially the true Church of Jesus Christ, they are simultaneously the most Christian fundamentalists of churches, and they are the most Chinese of churches. And so they really try to discourage their believers from even thinking about shamans or divinatory birds or anything that's traditional in their religion. So they try to stamp it out. And some of the Presbyterians in the past have also been very negative about traditional religion. The church that has been very open to syncretism has been the Roman Catholic Church. And that's why the grandmother of this guy, she's Roman Catholic. You go into her house and you just see the statues and the imagery. And that's the one that's been very open to syncretism, but less interested in the social movement. So it's rather interesting, the different dynamics in the different churches. And you asked me about the cross-strait relations here, the politics of that. And again, there's a great diversity across these communities. Gaojin Sumei has been very known for taking delegations of indigenous people to China, which recognizes them or calls them the 56th ethnic group of China. They're the 55th ethnic group of China. They're Gaosanzu. The 56th group is the Han. There's actually an order. The order is important there, from 1st to 56th. And Taiwan Gaosanzu is 55th. And I talked to people in the communities when she was doing that, and when she was also taking people to protest in front of the Yasukuni shrine, and found there's actually very little support for those types of political projects that she does. That being said, if you look at the election results, you can see that the KMT is very popular, and the percentage of indigenous people who voted for Han Kuo-yu in the last election is very high. It's somewhere around 80%. And so I think that actually the market for one country, two systems is probably with the indigenous people. They're probably the most favorable towards unification than any group in Taiwan. But they're a minority, and I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that the pro-unification necessarily means becoming part of communist China now. When they say they're pro-unification, they mean someday maybe something can happen. And I think the dominant idea is that the questions of unification and independence have nothing to do with the indigenous. So it's those Chinese people who are colonizing us. And quite often people would say, we don't really care who colonizes us. It's all the same. And these are just people, these are ordinary people in the village just telling me this, not the students who have their education about colonialism, but they would say, we were colonized by the Japanese and we did well. And then the ROC came And they tried to take away our language and our land, but we're still here and we still speak our language and we still have our land. And so even if the People's Republic of China comes, it's not going to make a difference. We're still going to be here and we're still going to survive anything. So that's kind of I think the more general thing would be to not be afraid of it.
Maxime, would you like to raise your question?
Yes, I will. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting. And I have a question, but first I want to clarify the terms. So as you said, indigenous people of Taiwan is not the homogeneous group, and it consists of many other groups. So is it appropriate to use the term tribe to them or no?
That is, I think you noticed in the talk, I very carefully avoided that word.
Yes, that's why I'm asking you about it. Is it lost the usage of it in our language today?
Yeah, so if you look at the Council of Indigenous Peoples website, the English version, you will see the word tribe. And it seems to me that everybody's used to using the word tribe. And I have made the decision not to. I think that tribe, it has negative connotations of a primitive level of political organization. And so it's historically been a way of denying the legitimacy of the political systems that existed prior to colonialism. And those political systems have been challenged by everything that's happened in the history. But many of those political ideas and even some of those political institutions still exist today simultaneously with the state. And so I think that rather than using the word tribe, which really minimalizes the value of all of that, I think that it's important to find other words, and saying indigenous peoples is a good way to do that. I think that the word nation, although I use it, has some difficulties as well, because it connotates, it implies a level of unity and agreement and consensus, which I do not see in Durugu and Sedek communities yet, at a level beyond the Aran. But that's Gaia. So once we're talking about Gaia, it's better almost, instead of to use their language, Alang. And that's basically the main political unit that they have. And we could translate that as being a nation or a First Nation, or we could translate it as community, but it's really their basic political unit. And they've always had the ability to make confederations with other Ala. But whether or not that can become a nation, I think is debatable. Those relationships have to be nourished through regular contact and ritual. And so it's not like the nation state that we know in Europe, and that Europe has exported to the world.
All right, thank you for this answer. And I have the second question. Where there's different groups and differences, there are always a place for the conflict. So I have a question. Is it any conflict in the cities between the representatives of different groups based on their origination from the different groups, or conflicts between the groups in the indigenous lands?
Oh, there are lots of conflicts going on. And just give one example. We don't have, but one example I give this, I showed the image of the young man, the shaman, right?
Yes.
And the MOFA website had said that he's from a Sedek Doda community in Hualien. And his village, actually, they call themselves Durugu. So there's a conflict that we can see there between a minority of people, even in these communities in Hualien, who don't accept the label of Durugu or Tailugutsu. And they hold on to this Sedek identity, which is the official identity up in Nantal. And that's of all the conflicts, and there are many conflicts, that's probably one of the most emotionally salient ones in that part of Taiwan, is that the proponents of Sedek, Saidekutsu, and the proponents of Tailugutsu are still very much in conflict with one another.
So if I understand correctly, it's oppression groups within the groups that are being oppressed.
Yeah, so there are within the groups because indigenous people as a whole, as a group, are oppressed and marginalized, and within that there are lots of conflicts. And I think that's to be expected. I think that conflict is part of being human. We have lots of conflicts at our university. I'm sure you do too. But within oppressed groups as well, there will always be conflicts. And I think often colonial powers will take advantage of those conflicts. And I think we're seeing some of that in everywhere. There's in Western Canada right now, there's some issues with pipelines and, you know, band councils and other hereditary leaders taking very different positions on that. So conflicts.
Carsten, your question.
Yeah, Carsten.
And we are nearing the closure of this lecture, but actually we can postpone the closure. We are not restricted to be very punctual in ending this session. So Carsten, please.
Yes, thank you, Astrid, and thank you, of course, to Scott for the presentation. When you started to talk about indigenous youth, my impression was that you were talking about them as a whole somehow. And the more you got on into your different issues like labor or activism and the social media engagement, the more it became clear that you were primarily talking about urban indigenous youth. And you also, I think you said so at the end of your presentation. So the question would be, what's going on with rural indigenous youth? Do they exist still, or are they kind of escaping rural areas because they don't see enough opportunities for their life, or do they engage or, you know, organize themselves in different forms, or do they have different topics to which they pay interest or so? Is there anything you can say on this rural youth?
Yeah, I can say that because I showed those images precisely to say that. So most of my, all of my research has been with the rural communities. And although some people have said that they're all become urbanized, they have not. 70% of Durugu still live in Hualien, in Shoulin, and Wanrong, and Zhouxixiang. Nantou Renaixiang still has a lot of young people. And so those photos were there to show the lives that they have. And so that's why there was the image of the church. And the churches have young people in them, and they've got a very dynamic Pentecostal type of Protestantism. They're very dynamic in the True Jesus Church. The Roman Catholic Church has been having a lot of trouble getting people recently, but the Protestants, they got a really lot of dynamic young people. I showed images of the young people in their 20s on the river there. And so that was basically showing the way that I couldn't take pictures of them when I was working in the rice fields because I was working in the rice fields with them. But actually there is a good economy for them. And they don't have to leave home, and they don't necessarily want to leave home, and their parents don't necessarily want them to leave home. And so all of these township governments are trying to do whatever they can to create opportunities for them. And that's why they actually appreciate employers like Asia Cement, because it permits them to stay. They also work quite a bit in the construction industry. And as you know, if you go to Taichung, for example, you see all these new buildings, and they're built by indigenous workers. And you know, they come and get them in the villages, and it only takes an hour to get to Taichung or less. And so they come in the morning with these trucks, and people jump in the trucks, and then they drive into Taichung, they work for the day, they come back in the late afternoon and have a beer, maybe go rest in that stream. And so, yeah, there are young people there, and they have jobs, and they're interested in their church. They go back to visit their old communities. They raise their children, because these people in their 20s are getting married and having babies. They're doing sports of all kinds, softball, I gave the picture of that, but there are archery contests, there are marathons, there are people who run, there's a basketball court, they love basketball. So they have these lives. And I would say that only about 20% of the youth go to university. So you've got the other 80% that are doing all of these other things and that are not as active in the social movement. In fact, they're often very, very critical of it and still vote KMT and still say that they're colonized and that they are in favor of affirming some kind of sovereignty. But
and what would be the reasons for them to be critical of the movement?
Well, you know, what they tend to say, and this is something that a lot of people have noticed, and we kind of read off from books about this, but they say, for example, they told him back then that we don't like this word Yunzumin. We like to be called Sandiran. That's fine. And calling us Yunzumin isn't going to change any of our problems. It's not going to get us a better job. It's not going to give me more money. And when I was there in 2004, when the Taiduketsu became recognized, they were saying the same thing about that. And then I went up to Nantou and they were talking about becoming Saideketsu, Sedek, and they said the same thing about that. And then the social movements want people to have the right to use their indigenous names for household registration. And almost everybody, even though they use their indigenous name in daily life, they say, what's the purpose of this? It's okay to have a Chinese name on my driver's license. And they often say, well, even if I do go and change my name at the household registration office, then I have to go change it on my driver's license. And then I have to change it on my credit card. And it's too much of a hassle. Why bother? It doesn't bring me anything. And that's just the name rectification one. And then when we get to questions like 自治 autonomy, right? And land, 土地, then we get much more complex. And I think there we get to a case where people are saying, well, we already are living on our land in the forests, and we have relations between hunters, and it works quite fine. So why do we need this little group of people coming and telling us we have to set up a government with a constitution that they've written for us when we're already, the hunters are saying this, that we're already managing our hunting grounds quite well. We don't need them. So people are skeptical, I think, of anyone in their community that comes in, especially from outside, and then says, I represent you. And so I think there's a lot of skepticism, but it doesn't mean that they don't agree with the intrinsic spirit and goals of the movement. And I think that there is a spirit really there, which they call Gaia, the people I work with, that runs throughout the community and in the movement, and it unites them.
And before we conclude this lecture, I would like to invite everybody to join us again on Saturday afternoon, 3 o'clock. Scott is going to join us again for a virtual discussion. And I think Gaia is also going to be an important aspect of the forthcoming discussion. If you do have time, then please do register for the workshop to get the film and the article Scott provided and his introduction beforehand, so that Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, we can concentrate on discussion. Scott, I would like to thank you very much for not leaving us before we could say goodbye to everybody. I would also tell everybody that Scott is coming to Europe virtually many times, not only Saturday, but also another forthcoming virtual lecture in Ljubljana. So you do have the opportunity to have a look, to join him again, and to ask all the remaining questions.
Yes, there's one more question. Felix here has a question.
Okay, then ask it. Scott
yes,
has time.
Exactly. I need to put on my headphones in order to avoid feedback. So can you hear me well?
Oh, yes.
Very good. I wonder why the church has interest in indigenous movements, because a consequent conclusion would be to reject Christianity because it also comes from outside and kind of oppresses the native beliefs. That's something which was confusing for me. And maybe you know the answer.
Well, Felix, I wish I knew the answer. I think one would actually have to delve into the theology of the Presbyterian Church. And for some reason or another, the Presbyterian Church tends to be strongly encourage all kinds of independence movements of different kinds. They were the first group to promote Taiwanese independence. And now they were big in promoting the Drugu independence from the SEDEC. So maybe, I don't know, it must have something to do with the nature of that particular church. The other churches don't do it. And so somebody who does theology would have to answer that.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyway, the churches provided a lot, like all the dictionaries of indigenous languages are done by missionaries and sold in the Catholic bookshop, as far as I know, in Taipei.
Yeah. And you know, the World Council of Churches in the 1970s held the first conference on discrimination against indigenous peoples. And they created the Declaration of Barbados as a result of that. Somehow the churches have been very important around the world in promoting indigenous rights, and they brought it to the UN, and it's taken on a life of its own. But then you're right, in Canada, I think that there's been a very difficult journey going on about dealing with the whole Catholic and Protestant residential school system. And so I think it differs from country to country, but what we're seeing now is in Taiwan, an indigenous social movement, which is rooted historically in the Presbyterian Church, and different ways of relating to the state in the other churches, not quite as mobilized in protests on the street, but still interesting ways of supporting indigenous people.
Scott.
Okay.
Enjoy your day.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing many of you on Saturday. And I wish I were there in person. I think we all wish that now.
Yeah, of course. And we could have Hirsch. There are many questions left. Do you still have time?
I think those are applause, but if people,
they are
want to
only
stay behind,
applauding.
Yeah.
Yes, probably only applauding.
So what I'll do is I'll be the last one to log on. I want to thank everybody. So have a good evening. Schönen Abend noch.
Yes, we will. Mr. Zachober, please close the session.
Okay, thank you. Tschüss.
Tschüss.